I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today's Brain and Behavior Research Seminar Series. Dr. Michael Alosco is an Associate Professor of Neurology and Vice Chair of Research at Boston University School of Medicine. He leads the BU Alzheimer's Disease Research Center Clinical Core and co-directs clinical research at the BU CTE Center. Dr. Alosco's groundbreaking research focuses on the relationship between traumatic brain injury and neurodegenerative diseases, particularly chronic traumatic encephalopathy. His work examines how repetitive head impacts affect brain function, and he's pioneering the development of biomarkers to detect these conditions during life. With over 220 peer-reviewed publications, Dr. Alosco leads multiple NIH-funded studies investigating plasma biomarkers for diagnosing Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. His research appears in prestigious journals, including Journal of the American Medical Association and Annals of Neurology. His contributions have earned him the Spivak Emerging Leader in Neuroscience Award and the Massachusetts Neuropsychological Society CERMAC Award for Outstanding Memory Research. Today, Dr. Alosco will present his latest findings on how repetitive traumatic brain injuries relate to white matter and vascular injury. Please welcome Dr. Michael Alosco.
Thank you so much. I'm just gonna, there we go. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Great, let me, all right, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I've known about the amazing research and work being done over at your center. And so I've been here since 2014 or 15. So it's I can't believe we're just kind of coming together now. So hopefully this will trigger some cool collaborations or thoughts for how our centers can kind of crosstalk a little bit more. So as mentioned, so today I am going to talk to you about something that I'm very, very excited about, very passionate about. And it's a lot of new research we're doing that's looking at the relationship between repetitive traumatic brain injuries and its effects on the white matter and other vascular consequences. As alluded to in the title, I think we've heard a lot about in the news or other places about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and I am going to talk about that during this talk to kind of set the stage, but most of the talk will focus on white matter and vascular injury. And please, I can see the room, but I can't see much of anything else. So if anyone has questions or wants to jump in, just feel free to start yelling at me. So I don't have any disclosures other than some funding. So I'd like to first just start off by laying the foundation of what we're talking about, just defining some terms. And the first term I will talk about here is repetitive head impacts. So repetitive head impacts, what are they? It's very intuitive. It's in its name. It's just repeated hits to the head. I think what's more controversial or what lacks a universal definition is what these repetitive head impacts can result in. So repetitive head impacts can result in symptomatic concussions. So it's an impact to the head or a force to the head that causes the brain to move inside the skull. And that injury to the brain results in symptoms, and that's a concussion. But what we're more focused on and what we're more worried about, perhaps, is the non-concussive injuries. So these are impacts or forces to the head that cause the brain to move, but they do not result in symptoms. And I want you to think about these types of impacts. I think it's easiest to visualize in the setting of something like tackle football. These are thousands upon sometimes thousands of head impacts throughout someone's lifetime. We're not talking about one concussion or two concussions. We're really talking about thousands of hits to the head. And we see that these thousands of hits to the head over the lifetime add up, and it's become known to be the primary risk factor for chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. So what is CTE? So this is what CTE looks like under a microscope. So right now, CTE can only be diagnosed through a neuropathological examination. And on the right here shows you its unique lesion. So all of the brown there is hyperphosphorylated tau, and the tau accumulates around a small blood vessel and it also tends to gather at the bottom of the folds of the brain, as you see here. So this pattern of tau around blood vessels and at the bottom of the folds of the brain is unique from any other neurodegenerative disease, different from Alzheimer's disease. The way that the tau, where it starts and how it progresses, is also quite different from something like Alzheimer's disease. So in CTE, it tends to first start in the frontal cortex, as you see in this image. It's pretty patchy, low-level pathology to begin with, so stage 1. But then it starts to progress to the adjacent cortices, so the temporal and parietal. And then it starts to affect the memory centers or the medial temporal lobes in stage 3, before you start to get really widespread disease in stage 4. Now, with the Alzheimer's disease, in contrast, I don't have an image next to it, but you really get more of a bottom-up pattern instead of this top-down pattern as comparison. What do we know about CTE risk? So to date, CTE has really nearly exclusively been described in the setting of repeated head trauma. And this is mostly elite contact sport athletes, so like professional American football players, but not exclusive to football. We've seen it in other settings, but we certainly know most in this setting. It has been closely linked with years of repetitive head impact. So in our brain bank, which is the largest brain bank of CTE tissue in the world, and repetitive traumatic brain injury tissue in the world, we have over 1,700 brain donors at this time. We see a very strong relationship between the number of years played of the sport, like football, and risk for developing CTE. What's I think really important to keep in mind, though, is that we see CTE quite frequently in our brain bank, but that's because we're studying people who are most concerned for CTE and who are most likely to have CTE. These are people who tend to play at really elite levels, and they tend to have symptoms. There's now been more research where they look for CTE in more community-based brain banks. So, for example, like the Framingham Heart Study, and you find CTE, you find low rates of CTE. And so what that tells us is that risk for CTE or prevalence of CTE is likely to be quite low in the general population, which is reassuring. But we likely are going to see it more commonly when you see it when people get to really elite levels of play. I like to think about CTE in this type of framework here. So we now know that this exposure to repetitive head impacts is necessary for the development of CTE. And we have now studies that links that tau pathology of CTE to various types of clinical symptoms, particularly cognitive symptoms. We also know, though, that not everyone who plays football or has this exposure is going to go on to develop CTE or symptoms. Many people are doing just fine. So the one question we're trying to answer is, what are the risk and resilience factors? Why do some people develop CTE and others do not? What are the different genetic factors, different lifestyle factors, and so on? Also, what we're increasingly seeing is that these repetitive head impacts, they can also affect presentation or lead to other types of pathology in the brain that might account for certain symptoms we see or contribute to certain symptoms. And that's an area that I'm going to focus on in this talk. So first, let's talk a little bit more about the symptoms. So we have these research criteria known as TES, or traumatic encephalopathy syndrome. These are criteria that are meant to reflect the clinical syndrome of CTE. So CTE is your neuropathological diagnosis or the cause. TES is the clinical manifestation of that disease. These were published in 2021. The original were published in 2014, but we actually found those original ones to be really poorly specific. They were sensitive, but poorly specific. So they were revised in 2021 in order to increase their specificity. And what they involve is that, I'm not showing you all of the criteria, but you have to have a certain threshold of exposure to repetitive head impacts. And then there's a set of core clinical features, These core clinical features include cognitive impairment, and particularly in memory and executive function. And there's also neurobehavioral dysregulation. So this refers to neuropsychiatric symptoms like trouble in managing emotions, being impulsive, being explosive, having a short fuse. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about, what we think might drive some of these symptoms in a bit. But in short, this phenotype here, neurobehavioral dysregulation, is really quite nuanced and complicated. We do emphasize that these aren't for use in the clinic. They're still for research purposes. And the main reason is because we're still evaluating their validity. A lot of these criteria were based on our interviews with informants of brain donors. So we didn't prospectively follow people and give them our objective measures. Although those studies are growing. We now have several studies. This one is done by a group out in Texas where they characterize what the different types of thinking, cognitive impairment phenotypes look like in older National Football League players. This is a study I did back in 2023, where we again looked at a large cohort of former college and professional football players. And both of these studies actually converged to show episodic memory as being the most common impairment. So we've done studies now to see to answer the question how CTE might relate to some of these symptoms. So this was a study we published back in 2024, where we had 364 brain donors with CTE. And we rated the presence and severity of tau across 10 different cortical and subcortical brain regions. And then the families the informants of the brain donors then completed these various standardized measures of cognition, mood, and behavior. And what we found was that the tau pathology strongly correlated with the cognitive symptoms. So this is showing the relationship between frontal tau and scores on things like the functional activities questionnaire, a metacognition index, and cognitive difficulty scale. These are all self-informant reported scales, and we found quite strong effects between the tau and these scales. I think was particularly informative of this study, though, was that we found very weak and inconsistent relationships with the mood and behavioral scales. So here we had 5 scales that measure aggression, impulsivity, behavioral regulation, apathy, and depression. And we only found one significant relationship with this measure of behavioral regulation, but it was actually it was significant, but it was much weaker, specifically when you compare it to the cognitive associations. So as I was kind of alluding to before, we think we see a lot of relationships with cognitive impairment in the tau of CTE. We're still trying to clarify, the different types of cognitive phenotypes, right? The patterns. What's less clear is what's causing these mood and behavior symptoms. There's a lot of different potential explanations. Of course, I don't think the tau is helping, but I also don't think it's the main driver. I think there's other pathologies potentially at play. And I think we also have to consider these people's personality. A lot of these people might be more aggressive or to begin with when they go into sports like football or et cetera. But that's where the co-pathologies come in. We've done a lot of work here in the brain bank that have tied these repetitive head impacts to different types of pathologies. So CTE, of course, being one of them. Now, what's different is CTE, you have to have this risk factor in order to get it. But these other types of pathologies, like Lewy body disease, CAA, white matter loss, of course, you can develop these without repetitive head impacts. But perhaps the repetitive head impacts might influence risk, or maybe they might alter how they present. Maybe it might present more severe. But what I really want to talk about is this white matter rarefaction or white matter pathology in general. What is the relationship between repetitive head impacts, and what is this pathology doing in terms of the symptoms? And this can actually be dated back to, the early 1990s, where where there's this case series looking at different microvasculature pathology in Alzheimer's disease and other types of dementias. And among this case series, they actually had two boxers who had dementia pugilistica. And dementia pugilistica, right, is what we now know as CTE. That's what it was referred to. But what they describe here is they described extensive microvascular pathology, a lot of loss of vascular branching, particularly in the orbitofrontal cortex. And they also noticed kind of co-localization of these tangles of tau and the microvascular pathology. And they hypothesized that there could be a connection between the head trauma, vascular injury, and then this accumulation of phosphorylated tau. Fast forward to 2013, when Dr. McKee kind of described CTE and its stages. Observation she made at each stage was just this progressive pathology of white matter and axonal disruption. And that was a consistent theme, starting off mild in stage 1 and progressive and getting worse all the way up through stage 4. So up until this point, it's really been kind of just been describing observations. In 2019, we wanted to really systematically study the role of white matter rarefaction and cerebral small vessel disease and tau and how they contribute to dementia and CTE. So this is a study we published, and we looked at these relationships in 180 deceased male former football players. They were all older than 40. These were the type of pathologies that were of interest. So in letter A here, you see a staining of myelin. That's healthy myelin. It's all nice and blue. But in letter B, you see here where there's loss of myelinated fibers. Letter C is arteriosclerosis, or small, affected disease of the small vessels. And then down below, you see the pathognomic lesion of CTE. We also looked at things like microinfarcts, microbleeds, infarcts, CAA, and et cetera. We didn't really find those pathologies weren't really that common, and we didn't find effects. So that's why I'm not showing you them here. So what did we find? So we did some structural equation modeling to map out the various pathways. The first path is not necessarily what's new to the field here. The first path shows that the more years of football play predicted more severe tau in the frontal cortex that in turn was associated with increased odds for having dementia. We've shown this relationship a couple of times by this point. What is new is that we then introduced white matter rarefaction, and we found that the years of football play also was associated with more severe white matter rarefaction, which in turn was associated with increased odds for having dementia. We also found that arteriosclerosis was associated with increased odds for dementia, but not years of football play. However, it was associated with hypertension, as we might expect. What I thought was particularly cool about this study was that the effect sizes, so the effect of white matter rarefaction and arteriosclerosis on dementia, was equal or greater than the effect of tau on dementia. So this was really one of the first studies that kind of laid the groundwork to say that dementia and CTE is multifactorial, and it has tau and non-tau correlates, particularly pathology to the white matter. So going on our pathology work kind of leads us into the next part of the talk in what we're doing during life in our in vivo imaging studies. So this is the scanner that we scan on here on Albany Street for all of our research participants. And this is where a lot of the work has come from on characterizing some of these white matter patterns. So the first technique that I won't actually spend too much time on is diffusion tensor imaging. So this was, there's been several studies that have shown relationships between repetitive head impacts and loss of lower fractional anisotropy and other DTI metrics, and that these DTI metrics are indeed associated with worse performance on our various neuropsychological test scores. This is just an example of one study that was done in 75 symptomatic former NFL players. I'm not going to focus on DTI because one, I'm more excited about what we're doing on FLAIR, which is you'll see next. But also I find that DTI can be more laborious. It's not as clinically relevant or routine in the setting of a dementia workup. And I think we have quite a bit of inconsistencies in the literature. So what we have been focusing on is, can we use FLAIR to pick up on some of these white matter and small vessel pathologies that we see associated with repetitive head impacts? And the big question is kind of why FLAIR? One, it's very routine and practical. We have a memory and aging clinic here at Boston Medical Center. Every person that will come will get a FLAIR sequence because it's an easy way for us to visualize if there's injury to the white matter and if that might be contributing to that person's symptoms. And it's also, from a research perspective, it's also quite easy to quantify and estimate. Now, there are caveats here, right? I think for all of us familiar with FLAIR and white matter hyperintensities, they are certainly non-specific. We all tend to get these as we get older. And so to some extent, these are expected with age. But I'm hoping by the end of this talk, you'll have some more appreciation for the potential specificity of these lesions in disease detection. So these have been looked at in the setting of former NFL players in the past. So this was a study back in 2013 where they actually found that the NFL players had higher deep white matter lesions, only in those who had cognitive deficits. They didn't find any difference in the periventricular lesions. And I think I want you to make a note of that because that pattern of these lesions being deep, I think, is important here. We did a study back in 2000 and when was this? 2018 now, where this was kind of a secondary data analysis. We had this larger data set on former NFL players and imaging, and as you know, through FreeSurfer, you can generate white matter hypointensity volume. And this was part of that data set. And I thought, based on the literature showing a lot of these white matter changes, maybe there's a relationship here in this data set. So we compared about 86 symptomatic former NFL players to 23 same-age men who had no history of repetitive head impacts. We looked at how different measures of repetitive head impacts might predict or be associated with these white matter hypointensities. And what we found that the former NFL players did have greater volume of these white matter hypointensities compared to the unexposed group. And that this novel measure of cumulative head impact index also was associated with greater white matter hypointensities as well, even after controlling for things like age and vascular risk factors too. And finally, these white matter hypointensities was also strongly associated with some of our measures of executive function. So at this time, this was, a preliminary study, and we wanted to pursue this a little bit further. And so this was actually, that study actually helped me to get a K award back in 2018. And the goal of that K award was to take it another step forward and look at FLAIR white matter hyperintensities instead of the T1 hypointensities, and to better kind of characterize their burden, better characterize their distribution, and how they might be associated with different measures of repetitive head impacts in former football players. So in this study, we had about 149 former football players, and then we had 53 asymptomatic unexposed men. They were both in their kind of later 50s. Of the football players, approximately 34% were Black or African American, compared to 36% in the control group. The football players consisted of about 68% who played professionally versus 31% who played in college. The football players did have more alcohol use disorder symptoms compared to the controls. They had a higher body mass index. Interestingly, when we looked at this Framingham stroke risk profile, the controls had a slightly higher score, although I wouldn't say it was meaningful. We quantified FLAIR, the white matter hyperintensities. So we quantified both total volume and total number using the lesion segmentation toolbox, as you can see here. So very, very easy tool to use to quantify these lesions. In order to get regional, we used Free Surfer, and we labeled the different white matter regions based on their location using the Deskin-Kiliani atlas, and then assigned, and wherever that lesion was proximal to was the location of that lesion. And then we combined them into for the different lobes, so frontal, temporal, and parietal and occipital lobe, in order to see if any of the different lobes were affected. The first thing we noticed was a strong association between age and these white matter hyperintensities, which perhaps isn't surprising. So what we actually did was we looked at the results in both the total sample, but then we also stratified by about the median age of 60 of the sample, and to see if our results would change by age. And that's actually exactly what we noticed. So on the right, you see that the former football players had more white matter hyperintensities, total volume, compared to the men, but only in those who were 60 years or older. So we didn't find any effect in those who were younger than 60. And another important thing to note, these results control for age, BMI, vascular risk, ApoE, and those are the main ones, maybe a couple other variables too. When we looked at the lobes, we also noticed that only in those who were 60 years or older, we found greater volume in the frontal, temporal, and parietal, but not the occipital. We also did not observe any effects, like I said, in those who are younger than 60. We repeated all models. So we had those original covariates, then we threw in sleep apnea, we threw in cholesterol, alcohol use, everything remained. Even when we included these other variables known to be associated with white matter hyperintensities in the model. We then looked at relationships between different proxies of repetitive head impacts. And what we found was that age of first exposure was associated with white matter hyperintensity. So the younger you started to play football, the more volume of these hyperintensities we observed in only people who are 60 years or older. So what's interesting about this pattern is that the literature on this topic is really quite mixed, and perhaps a whole separate talk. But the literature shows that people who start to play younger, age of first exposure, we don't see any association with symptoms or outcomes in young people who are perhaps still playing sports, who are otherwise healthy. But we do see an association between this variable and outcomes when we're talking about older people who seem to have pathology and seem to have symptoms. So we think perhaps that maybe that this might reduce someone's resilience to cope with pathology as they get older. But it's really inconsistent at this point. We're still trying to better understand these relationships. So as a follow-up study, we wanted to see, okay, what are some of the pathological correlates of these hyperintensities? So for this study, we worked with Madeline Uretsky, who's now off in grad school, but we took our brain bank here. And as part of our brain bank, we collect medical records on everyone. And in those medical records, we also collect scans that they might have done during life clinically. So now with that, you're going to get scans. We had scans that were a variable quality done on different type of scanners. So you get a lot of noise there, but at the advantage is you have the actual pathology after death. And so in this study, what we found was that we looked at each scan, at all the flares. We estimated the lesions based using the lesion segmentation toolbox again. And we found that in this brain bank of repetitive head impact donors, these lesions correlated with white matter loss, arteriosclerosis, but also tau pathology, and specifically CTE tau pathology. And so here, again, speaking to these multifactorial causes of the white matter hyperintensities, but I think what's interesting here is this correlation with the tau, which we've seen in Alzheimer's disease, and now we see this in the setting of CTE too. In that study, we similarly saw that the more years of football play, again, predicted more, was associated more, greater volume of these white matter hyperintensities. So up until this point, I've showed you research that has revealed more higher volume of white matter hyperintensities in former football players. So seemingly seems to be associated with repetitive head impacts. That these white matter hyperintensities in the setting have both tau and white matter pathological correlates. But I still think that there's a lot more questions to be answered. And one of the questions that we're particularly excited about is this question. And this is a question being worked on by Jenna Groh, who's a PhD student who's defending next month, actually. And a lot of her research has been focused on this question. Is there a unique pattern of white matter hyperintensities that can result from repetitive head impacts? I think so far the data I showed you doesn't necessarily speak to a unique pattern, but perhaps speaks to an association. So what do we see in aging? So if this, to me, this is kind of a typical scan you would expect to see in someone in their 60s or 70s. It seems to be perhaps of a moderate severity. Namely, what you see is white matter hyperintensities around the ventricles. It seems to start to becoming confluent in some regions. This is kind of very typical of what we see in aging. What's really cool is this research that's looking at how these white matter hyperintensities co-localize with pathology of the different neurodegenerative diseases. So this is a really nice study done in behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia and also Alzheimer's disease. And they looked at 129 patients, 64 with FTD, 65 with AD. And what the take-home message here was that the patients the patients with FTD and AD, the patterns of white matter hyperintensities actually mirrored the patterns of cortical atrophy or disease that are consistent with FTD and AD. So in FTD, more frontal versus more posterior patterns in Alzheimer's disease. So I think why this is notable is because it just shows that perhaps in some situations, these hyperintensities can have some specificity to an underlying disease that might be happening. This is a nice figure here. If you look at letter A, this is some ex vivo imaging where they did some diffusion tensor imaging, and they found a lot of kind of pathology in the U fibers that co-localize with tau pathology from CTE, right? And this is like in letter B, you see the location of that tau pathology where CTE is. And then you see our pattern that I'm describing you with these white matter lesions appearing again at this gray white matter interface, all kind of focused on this specific location. And this has been described to be an anatomical stress point for trauma because it's particularly susceptible to kind of the rotational and tearing forces that happens when your brain's moving around in your skull. So the big question that we had, these are to date, this is kind of what we've been anecdotally observing, is how are you going to quantify this, right? Our pipelines are not going to pick this up, our traditional pipelines. What we've done is we've done visual ratings so far. So this is unpublished. This is work being done by Jenna Groh's dissertation. We went through some data sets and we created a manual. We worked with our neuroradiology colleagues to create a system to count the number of lesions in the sequence. And what we found was that we see these lesions most commonly in professional football players, followed by college, and then least commonly in controls, right? So you have some overlap, but you can kind of see that these lesions increase as the amount of exposure to repetitive head impacts goes up. We find that these lesions are associated with some of our biomarkers of tau pathology on tau PET, as well as in the plasma, including of axonal injury with neurofilament light. And we've also observed this pattern and associations in a second independent data set from our ADRC, where we see more of these lesions in people who've had repetitive head impacts compared to those who did not. Now, remember, these non-repetitive head impact group, these include people who have things like Alzheimer's disease and other types of dementia. The thing that they don't have is repetitive head impacts. So unfortunately, what's really hard here is that people with like Alzheimer's disease, you have these moderate extensive cases where it's just so confluent that it's really hard to kind of not count, that confluent stuff around the ventricles because it becomes so overwhelming. But this is kind of an interesting, another kind of validation in this data set. What's really exciting is we've now done some ex vivo imaging on one case where this case had that pattern, and we put the tissue into the MRI scanner, and then you can see here on on where my cursor is, we were able to locate that lesion in tissue, and that lesion was co-localized with the tau pathology of CTE. So where that lesion was also was where the so-called death tau was, and it was also associated with loss in the myelin. And within that lesion, we noticed kind of reactive astrocytes, glial scarring, and kind of increased activated microglia. So a lot of neuroinflammation going on there. Now, I think all of this converges to say, yes, this is an area where there's a hyperintensities that seems to have a lot of pathology around it, that perhaps is related to repetitive head impacts. I think what we want to do next is do the same thing, but look at a different region. So look at white matter hyperintensities around the ventricles, perhaps like where we see an aging, to see how that pathology might be different. And then also look at kind of other types of cases and non-repetitive head impact tissue. Another thing we're trying to do is we're working with Adam Brickman in Columbia Alzheimer's Center, where we're trying to find an automated way to quantify these lesions. So we're trying to get at things like sphericity of the lesions, how their distance to the cortex, their distance to other lesions, the average size of the clusters, and so on. But it is really proving, this part of it's proving to be really challenging because the threshold for detection of lesion, if you put the threshold too high, you're going to miss them. Too low, you're counting all this noise. So it's been really hard to capture these little lesions. So if I had to kind of wrap it all up, I think what we're seeing is that there might be an association between these repetitive head impacts and repetitive TBIs and their long-term effects on the white matter. I will say we have some inconsistencies still in the literature that need to kind of be worked out. We need some larger samples, some large longitudinal studies as well. And I think, back to the question, are they associated with unique pattern white matter hyperintensities? I think, we definitely need more data, more time, more funding. And of course, there's, I didn't talk about all the differential considerations, but we can't rule out potential from vascular risk factors, post-traumatic headaches, multiple sclerosis. These are all things we need to think about as we're trying to answer this question. And really, I'm most interested in, we like I talked about, we have this really kind of debilitating neuropsychiatric phenotype we see in CTE, but what is really kind of their cause? And I suspect that a lot of that is due to kind of it's kind of a disconnection syndrome and a lot of injury to the white matter. We have this ongoing R01 that I'm currently writing the renewal for. Actually, it's with UCSF, where it's looking at the part of that data I showed you is from this R01, but we're looking at this group of people who have repetitive head impacts. They're getting various MRI and plasma fluid biomarkers to quantify tau, amyloid, and white matter and vascular pathology. And then in parallel, we're also doing various pathological evaluations as well so that the in vivo and ex vivo aims can inform each other. So with that, I think I still left plenty of time for questions, but I wanted to again thank you all for having me, and I hope I convinced you a little bit that these white matter hyperintensities are interesting.
Thank you, Michael. That was amazing. And I can speak for myself. You don't have to convince me. I mean, I'm already convinced, and I loved it. That was really amazing. Do we have any questions? People that are online, please feel free to post your questions on chat.
I have a question.
Yes.
If I can start it off. I was going to say, especially in this group, you don't have to convince us that they're interesting, but something that I was thinking about that you said in the younger population that have had this repeated injury, there's some inconsistencies. And I'm wondering if it may be because like they're younger, so they're more likely to be closer to the actual injury. And so the brain is still, you know, working to like have a response of trying to like not fix, but you know, they have more of a response to it. And then as time progresses, the person gets older, but then it's also more the like recovery mechanism of the brain is more stable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this comes out more with age, but I would also say, and there's probably, well, there is a certain, probably a threshold of pathology needed for it to appear as hyper intense too, right? But I would also say that I think the inconsistencies actually stem from people looking at like total volume, right? And not looking at this pattern. Because actually, when I do talk to people who are studying younger, like soccer or other types of contact sport athletes, and I show them this pattern, like, oh, they're like, oh, I've definitely seen that. And so nobody's really characterized this pattern yet. Instead, they're just using our pipelines to say there's no association with volume. So I think it's part of like how we're looking at it in the data potentially. But I do think that if you see this pattern in a younger cohort, I think that's super compelling for a story where you see kind of injury triggering something and then maybe gets worse with age.
Can I follow up on that? Because I was sort of listening to your talk and thinking that the repeated head injury set something off in the aging, the older adults. I know Nicole was asking about the young adults, but in the older adults, it set something off that seems to accelerate decline or sort of this degeneration in older adults. But at the same time, the brain's ability to repair, so measurements of astrocytes and so forth, are actually also in play there. So I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about the potential mechanism of what, I don't know, chicken and egg, what starts what?
Yeah.
Like, what's the cascading process here that might be happening?
Right. I think I don't know if you know John Cherry, but he has some interesting work here from our center where he shows kind of a feedback loop between repetitive head impacts, neuroinflammatory processes, tau, and symptoms. And it seems to be, or the hypothesis is that a state of something's going on with the inflammatory process at the time of injury that triggers some cascade of events that then kind of gets worse with aging to precipitate the tau pathology that probably then again precipitates the inflammation again, right? So he has some really interesting work that does some modeling of that, but I think CTE is perhaps unique in that I think it's a disease of, by definition, it's a disease of tau, but I think it's a disease of many pathologies as well, because I think repetitive head impacts can lead you down so many different ways that it is not just tau based.
Yeah.
Can I chime in? So yeah, I really enjoyed your talk, and
Yeah.
I'm really worried about my son because my son is a hockey player and goalie, and is is playing in the varsity. So like my question is that is there any data that how the amount of the frequency of the repetitive impacts or the severity of the impacts
Yeah.
can be quantified to account for your data?
Yeah, so we published a study actually just last year where this was again in football. So to kind of going back to your worry, I think we have most concern about football. I think tackle football, like the head impacts are just so ubiquitous to the game that it's just happening all the time. In other sports, it's not happening as frequent. Not to say there's not a risk, but it's just not as frequent. And even the way that we play today is so much different than how it was played back in the day. So there's a lot more safety measures. Like in ice hockey, you can't check to a certain age, right? Things like that. but what we found is that it's the combination of both frequency and magnitude as the most important drivers of things like CTE. So really a lot of hits at a high force is really important. And again, we see CTE in most in people who play at really high levels for a really long period of time. So like 25, think about like 20 years of football, including a lot of college and professional. So it has to be a lot of hits and a lot of hits at high force. One or two, I think one of the biggest misconception is that a concussion, 2 concussions, 3 concussions, like that's gonna result in bad outcomes. And it doesn't. I mean, concussions are bad, right? But most people, 90% recover from concussion, 10%, have persistent symptoms, but again, can usually recover over a longer period of time.
I have a question. I was kind of struck by your table that had all the demographic characteristics of your sample because you had such sort of a balanced divide of Black individuals and white individuals, which is something we don't often get in our studies.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, knowing that in terms of dementia, sometimes we see differences in the neuropathology between different races, with neuroinflammation and vascular involvement. Would you expect differences in terms of the CTE manifestation, either behaviorally or on these, neuroimaging scans or anything?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question that we have studied and are studying. So one is we have higher rates of Black or African American because remember we're studying football players in those samples, right? So it's changed over time, but it's gone from like 40% Black or African American up to like 70% more now where we today. So our findings are actually kind of representative of who we're studying in terms of the population. And we've actually seen some race differences on our neuropsych scores. So we do see in some of our papers that the Black or African American footballs had worse executive function compared to the white football players. And we have a study that is being led by Robert Turner. It hasn't been submitted, but we see those differences. Great. What explains it though, right? And so now we've looked at a whole host of different factors that might explain those differences that he's about to submit soon. Long story short is we find some interesting explanations, but nothing to write home about, mostly because the studies weren't designed to really study these questions. So we need kind of to do that from the beginning. We're looking at our brain bank. So to your other point is our brain bank has about, depending on the sample, you're looking about 15 to 16% are Black or African Americans, and that's really high for a brain bank, right? And so we're looking at some interesting questions there as well with the pathology too.
Very cool. Thanks.
I have sort of a related question in terms of one of the tables you presented at the beginning. I think one of the factors was something about like community re-engagement after play or something. And I'm curious about, looking at life post-professional sports, like how their career after that sort of impacts their decline or their presence of neuropathology.
Yeah, I mean, so absolutely. So the people we study are they're many years post-retirement, but I think you're right. Like we've often heard of it described as kind of readjustment, analogous to like readjustment after military. So they're like their athletics have kept their life so structured and oriented that when that goes away, it's really can be debilitating for them. And we're trying now to move towards a model of doing more of a life course study. The thing is, it's really hard, right? Like the ideal studies, you follow them while they're playing all the way up until they're older, and that's 100 years, right? So how can you kind of do these life course studies where you can get information on what's happening when they're younger and then middle age and older? But I think you're spot on. I think this cohort is just so unique and has so many factors contributing to symptoms that you really need to kind of take a really dynamic approach to studying them.
Can I ask maybe the last question? I know we're over time,
Yeah.
but if you were to tell, worried family members, I don't know who the audience is, but what is the most salient cognitive symptom that would be a red flag?
So we are noticing trouble with episodic memory. But but it's hard. It mirrors what you see in Alzheimer's disease. And so what often happens is people will come to us, they'll have memory concerns, and they'll have episodic memory impairment on our tests. They're older, and so, but what we have for Alzheimer's disease is really good biomarkers to say, no, Alzheimer's disease is likely not present. And then all by process of elimination, you can kind of then get down to your hypothesis that, well, there's not much else going on here, except this person has tons and tons of repetitive head impact exposure. This could be underlying CTE.
It's surprising you said that because I thought you were going to say the first sign is sort of anger or sort of behavioral management, because that seems to be what is worrisome to them. But episodic memory is so general, like.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I didn't say neuro, I mean, you're right. You do hear about those neurobehavioral dysregulation symptoms. But in my opinion, like clinically, I think it's just a lot harder to identify a cause to those symptoms. Like our data don't show strong relationships with tau. A lot of these people can have a predisposition to psychiatric symptoms. So is this just psychiatric manifestations? Whereas the cognitive impairment, typically you see that in the setting of a neurodegenerative disease, right? So I think it becomes really challenging in differential diagnosis when you have these psychiatric symptoms.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for the work you're doing. It's so important.
No, thank you. I really appreciate the invitation, and I hope we can stay in touch more.